The Vivo NEX is a really interesting device and also one that packs in a surprisingly good camera setup. This much was clear from our first impressions. But just how good is this camera setup? This is Sandeep from RevAtlas. Let's find out. The rear camera consists of a 12MP Sony IMX363 f1.8 unit with 1x2.55 inch sensor size, 1.4 micron pixel size, optical image stabilization, and dual pixel autofocus. It also has a secondary 5MP f2.4 depth sensor to assist it. The images shot on the Vivo NEX are pretty good, but you can see that the hardware is being limited by software. The sharpness isn't reaching the levels it should be reaching despite having optical image stabilization and a fast shutter, not to mention low ISO. Considering it uses a Sony IMX363, a Google camera port should help it do much better. What the stock camera app does well, however, are the colors as well as the white balancing. It also has a pretty quick shutter speed and instantaneous focus lock thanks to a dual pixel autofocus. The HDR mode works well to boost the shadows, which can become underexposed without it. However, at times that boost becomes a bit too overpowering that the images look kind of flat and washed out, so you may have to manually tweak the contrast a bit, but in most situations it gives you a much needed boost to dynamic range, especially when the highlights have a tendency to get blown out. Low light performance is pretty good and noise is kept at reasonable levels. The phone manages to capture well exposed images thanks to a large pixel size and aperture. There's a drop in sharpness due to noise reduction being applied, but is not too evident unless you pixel peep. Coming to portrait mode, the blurring algorithm does pretty well when it comes to applying blur to objects or subjects when there isn't much of a depth to deal with, but when there's difference in depth in terms of objects and subjects, it does tend to kind of miss out portions or have faults in the blur unless you get lucky enough with shots such as this. There's also a visible reduction in sharpness on the portion in focus compared to regular shots, but the main thing that bothered me was the oversaturating of images when using portrait mode from time to time. The front-facing camera is an 8MP f2 unit, and the novelty is that it's completely hidden from sight unless you need it. When you turn on the front-facing camera from any app, it pops up slowly thanks to a motorized mechanism that's quite strong, and it also goes back in when you're done with it. The front-facing camera has limited dynamic range that can be improved a lot using the HDR mode. The sharpness and detailing are decent, but not too great either. Guess most of the R&D was spent to innovate on the camera mechanism rather than outright quality itself. Portrait mode is decent, but again the algorithm doesn't detect edges too well. The NEX can capture videos up to 4K resolution at 30fps. In 4K mode it supports a bitrate of around 41 Mbps, while in 30fps 1080p mode the bitrate drops drastically to around 16 Mbps. Unless you're trying to save on space, we suggest that you use the 4K 30fps mode since there's no difference in stabilization on either. Both 4K and 1080p mode support OIS, but there's no EIS. As a result, the footage is slightly stable but doesn't look as refined as videos from competing phones with EIS. If you keep your hands steady and don't move around much, the footage is very usable, or else you're better off using a gimbal. There's pretty good contrast and detailing on the 4K videos, while the 1080p mode retains the contrast but loses out on sharpness and detailing. The front-facing camera isn't very good in terms of quality of video, as there seems to be quite a degradation in quality. No EIS doesn't help either. Would have been fine for a cheaper phone, but not for a flagship. So this is the front-facing camera on the Vivo NEX capturing 1080p video. Let me know what you guys think about the overall sharpness, the video quality, the dynamic range, how well it's picking up my voice in this particular environment, and also how well it's handling the stabilization. There's a time-lapse mode that can capture at 4K resolution, and it works really well. Slow motion videos are limited to 720p and the quality is a bit poor. Overall, the quality of the cameras on the Vivo NEX seem pretty good, especially at the rear, but it's something that's kind of let down a bit by the software. If you're using Google Cam or any other camera port, perhaps you can get better quality from the rear-facing cameras and even perhaps from the front-facing camera. While it's still not as good as say the OnePlus 6 or most of the other flagships in this segment, it still is pretty good for a Vivo phone, and I would say that this is a step in the right direction. If the camera is not your uttermost priority, and you actually prefer a device for content consumption and also a bit of content creation, then this could be one smartphone that is worth considering. Thanks for watching this video. See you again in the next one.